this evening as we continue our studies in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah, as we have discussed, is a prophet during the period of return from captivity. And the first few chapters we talked about were visions. And one of the main lessons from those visions, well, two of the main lessons I want to mention. One was that their enemies who had taken Judah into captivity and mistreated them and so on were going to be punished. But the other thing was that the return of Judah was restoring them to God's favor. But all of this was symbolic of Jesus as the king of his kingdom and the spiritual defeat of his spiritual enemies. In the last several chapters, discuss then Judah and her relationship with her enemies and some various aspects that we've been studying that relate to Judah and her enemies, but also then symbolize Jesus Christ and his messianic reign compared to his spiritual enemies. So we talked about some days of fasting, and now we're discussing chapters 9 through 11 and the judgment on the enemies compared to the blessings and judgment on Judah. But before we get into a specific discussion this evening, I've spent some extra time thinking about some of the things we struggled with last time and tried to get an overview of these three chapters. Now, you might happen to notice that the word suggested has been highlighted on the chart. And that's because I think this is going to be helpful, but I recognize that this is a tough section. We talked about that last time, that these last 6 chapters are some of the hardest, if not the hardest chapters in the Old Testament to understand. And the things that I have to admit, honestly, I'm not sure about. So I'm trying to give an overview that might be helpful. If there's some things here that you question or you have problems with, don't feel bad about bringing those up. I've already changed my mind about a few things as I've studied this. So here's what I came up with as an overview of these 3 chapters. Chapter 9 was discussing the punishment of Judah's enemies and then the blessings that would come upon the people who would serve God under the Messianic kingdom. That's pretty much what we talked about when we talked about that chapter, wasn't it? Talked about, first of all, the Tyre and Sidon and the Philistines and so on would be punished. Then it talked about that Jesus would come, the triumphal entry and so on, and the rest of the chapter, the blessings on God's people as a result. And all of that relates back to those visions in the first 6 chapters where the punishment of the enemies was, and then the blessings on God's people was symbolic of the kingdom of Christ under the New Testament. So that part I thought was fairly straightforward. We got to chapter 10 last time, and this is where it became more difficult, at least for me. And it seems to me now that in chapter 10 he's gone back to the literal return of the people of Judah being restored from the Babylon captivity and the defeat of their enemies that had mistreated them at that time. So where chapter 9 got into the Messianic kingdom, in my view, chapter 10 now has gone back to the literal return from Babylonian captivity and the defeat of the enemies that had mistreated Judah. Now, there's some things about that are not easy, and maybe there's something I'm missing. Chapter 11, then, I believe, goes back again to the Messianic kingdom. It describes how that certain false leaders of the people would reject Jesus and cause the people to reject Jesus, and that would lead to the downfall of the nation at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 under the New Testament. Now, that's what I see as an overview, and again, like I said, if you have some other view, we're perfectly willing to discuss it, but hopefully that may give us a track to run on as we look at these 3 chapters. So if you look then specifically at chapter 9, we saw the punishment of Tyre and Sidon and the Philistines, and then talked about Zion's king would come, the triumphal entry and so on, and then the people would be like jewels in his crown that he would protect and save under the Messianic kingdom. That was chapter 9. Chapter 10, then, we began last time, which is where we take up this evening, specifically in verse 6 of chapter 10. And again, I believe that he's reverted or flashed back, and prophets often did this. This is not unusual for this to happen. Isaiah does it a lot. Lots of the prophets have switched back and forth from the future and the Messianic kingdom of Christ and so on back to the people of their own day, and then back to the Messianic kingdom and so on. It seems to me that chapter 10 has gone back to the people of Zechariah's day as they returned from captivity, and the punishment on their enemies and so on. So he begins by talking about the idols and the prophets who spoke lies in the name of the idols. The idols did not bless the people like God would bless them. And so the people who followed them were like sheep without a shepherd in verse 2. And so God was angry with the shepherds, and they would be, is going to punish them and so on. The difficult part, or one of the difficult parts for this view, was in chapter 5, which we mentioned last week. It describes that God's people would be like mighty men and tread down their enemies in the mire of the streets and so on, and the Lord would be with them, and the riders on horses would be put to shame. The enemies would be defeated. We pointed out that that doesn't seem to fit, because there was never a time when Judah, after the return, had battles where they defeated their enemies and so on, at any great extent. However, the explanation that I would give, and again, you evaluate it, I would like to point out, he says that they shall be like mighty men. It's a symbol. He isn't saying that they would be mighty men and defeat their enemies, and so forth. And in fact, you go down to verse 7, he continues, he says, those of Ephraim shall be like a mighty man, and their heart shall rejoice as if with wine. So if this is symbolism, which it may very well be, then it's not saying that there would be physical battles, but the result of the defeat of the enemies, where the people of God would return from captivity. The enemies would be defeated, not because the people of Judah actually had warfare, but the end result would be enemies defeated, God's people restored from captivity, would be as if they had won the battle. Not that they really did, but that would be the effect of it, as though they were the victors. Which, if that's so, that's true in our relationship with the Lord as well. We are victors through him, not because we are so great, but spiritually, that would be true as well. So that's my explanation of verse 5 as I've tried to study it through. You can, again, comment on it or think about it as you prefer, but that brings us to verse 5. All right, with that lengthy introduction, questions, comments through verse 5. Let's take up then in verse 6, and let's see as we follow through chapter 10 how this fits, and if it does fit, the physical return of Judah and the defeat of their enemies. So let's read the rest of the chapter. Who'd like to read chapter 10, verse 6 through 12? Chapter 10, verse 6 through 12. Would like to read that for us, please? Steve, please.
I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph. I will bring them back, because I have mercy on them. They shall be as though I had not cast them aside, for I am the Lord their God, and I will hear them. Those of Ephraim shall be like a mighty man, and their heart shall rejoice as if with wine. Yes, their children shall see it and be glad. Their heart shall rejoice in the Lord. I will whistle for them and gather them, for I will redeem them, and they shall increase as they once increased. I will sow them among the peoples, and they shall remember me in far countries. They shall live together with their children, and they shall return. I will also bring them back from the land of Egypt, and gather them from Assyria. I will bring them into the land of Gilead and Lebanon, until no more room is found for them. He shall pass through the sea with affliction, and strike the waves of the sea. All the depths of the river shall dry up. Then the pride of Syria shall be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt shall depart. So I will strengthen them in the Lord, and they shall walk up and down in his name, says the Lord.
Okay. So, verse 6, what does God promise to do for the people in verse 6? And we're continuing question number 8 and 9. And what did God promise to do for the people in verse 6? Bill.
He's going to strengthen the house of Judah and save the house of Joseph, and bring them back and have mercy on them.
Okay. So they're going to come back. Now notice the house of Judah, well, okay, that's the southern tribes, the southern nation. Who's the house of Joseph? Who does that refer to? The house of Joseph would be who? Debbie?
Ephraim and Manasseh, but he means Ephraim here.
Okay, which would be the northern tribes. So those who returned from captivity were primarily Judah, but there were also some from the northern tribes who returned, and that's discussed in several scriptures as well, that it shows that those who returned included some, although it was a majority of them was from the southern tribes, but a minority were from the northern tribes. So some of both would return. God would bring them back and have mercy on them. What would be the end result of that? The last part of verse 6. When they returned, what would happen? What would be the result of it? Carrie.
He would have mercy on them.
Mercy on them as though he had not cast them aside. In other words, back before their captivity, back before when things were well between him and them, it would be restored that way, which was what a lot of those visions were about. The restoration of their relationship with God as though he had not cast them aside. He's the Lord their God, he would hear them, and so on. All right, so as far as I can see, a description of the return from captivity and the blessing of their relationship with God again. Other comments? Verse 6. Okay, verse 7. Rick.
Over in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 18, it says, "In those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I have given as an inheritance to your fathers."
What was the reference again, Rick?
Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 18.
Okay, now I would have to look at that particular passage, but there are several passages like that. They talk about those who return would be not just those from the house of Judah, but also from the northern tribes would come back and return from the captivity. Okay? Other comments on that passage or other passages? You've got in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 3 is another one of the passages that talks about it. Ezekiel talks about it several times as well. That people from the northern tribes as well would return from the captivity. God would have mercy upon them both. Okay? Now you have to remember, at the time that Zechariah and Haggai prophesied, was the first group had returned from captivity, and as in the book of Ezra, we're rebuilding the temple. But there were other groups that returned later on. Okay, so this returning from captivity wasn't over at the time that Zechariah is talking about. It was in the process of happening. Okay, so it seems to me that God is saying that this is going to continue as they continue to come, groups come back. Anything else on verse 6? Bill?
In Hosea 1, verse 7, it says about the same thing, that he'll have mercy on the house of Judah and will save them by the Lord their God. And I will save them by my bow, or by my sword or battle, by horses or horsemen.
Okay, and we remember from our study of the book of Hosea how that God said that the people, that was talking about the northern tribes, that they would be captive just like God would reject them, like Hosea had divorced his wife for her adultery, but that they would again become his people. Not my people, but would become his people. And that's what goes along with what we're saying here. Right, verse 7 then talks about those of Ephraim. So not just those of Judah, but specifically those of Joseph would include those of Ephraim. And what would they be like? Verse 7. And that's question number 10 now. What would Ephraim be like? Steve?
Mighty men.
Like mighty men. Again, it doesn't say that they would be a mighty man, but they would be like that. And the result would be joy, as if with wine. The children would see it and be glad. Their heart would rejoice in the Lord. Okay, so some of Ephraim would be blessed as though they were mighty men who had won this victory and so on, rejoicing as in a victory. this is the comparison. Other comments on verse 7. Okay, so returning from captivity, the enemies are going to be punished. It's going to be like rejoicing is returning from a victory through verse 7. Other comments on verse 7. Okay, verse 8 then. How does he describe it in verse 8? Question number 11. How do you describe it in verse 8? Steve.
You whistle for them.
Whistle for them and gather them. What does that remind you of? What does that sound like? Whistle for them and gather them would be like what? Frank.
Be like calling them with fondness. With fondness,
Okay, fondness.
like a lot of times a father will whistle for his to call his children to him.
Okay. All right. I've known fathers to do that, to whistle, and their children are expected to come. Steve?
As a shepherd with his pipe calls his sheep.
Or a shepherd calling sheep, or some people call their animals that way, with certain symbols, whistles or whatever. And then the sheep are expected, the animals, whatever, children are expected to come. And God would redeem them, and they shall increase as they once increased. There would be benefits again, prosperity, as though they had been at one time in their history. They would have that blessing and an increase and so on, rather than being punished and destroyed by their enemies and so on. So again, this seems to fit the idea of the return from captivity. That it's begun, it's going to continue. God's going to bring the people, not just from Judah, but also from Ephraim, as well, they're the victors now. And they're rejoicing in their return and their victory. Other comments, verse 8. Okay, now verse 9 has another difficulty for us, at least from what I've been trying to say. What you're going to do in verse 9, according to what he's going to do. For question number 13 now. What does he say he's going to do in verse 9? Rick?
He's going to sow them among other peoples. They shall remember in far countries.
All right. So he's going to sow them among the peoples. Who are the peoples? Peoples are Gentiles. And they'll be in the far countries, and they'll remember him in those far countries. Okay? Live there with their children and then return. Well, okay. Comments? Jerry?
Seems to be a reference to the captivity that he's going to, if we're talking about the physical Israel in this, they were scattered, sown among the people, and they remembered him among the people, and they longed to be back in Jerusalem. And he's saying, that's going to happen, but I'm going to bring you back.
Okay, so if it refers to the physical captivity, when they were scattered among these other countries, they would remember him, which they did, many of them, and that they would live there with their children, and they would return. All that fits. The part that I struggle with is the first part, I will sow them among the peoples as the future. But in Zechariah's day, that's already happened. And now they're beginning to remember and come back. So that's the part I struggle with. The part about them remembering and coming back, okay, that's fine. That fits the physical return. But I will sow them among the people. Thoughts on that? I've got a theory, but that's that I struggled with that. Jerry?
If it's a blending of the two things, and the spiritual looking forward into the time of the Messiah, God's people would be scattered all over the earth. And so, not just in one place, but they would be all over the world, among Gentiles, among strangers all over the world.
Okay, so that then would make it not the physical, but the spiritual.
And I've heard this described as sometimes when you're at a distance looking at mountain ranges and they blend together and you see they're, from your point of view, you're seeing just one mountain range with lots of mountains in it. But if you look at it from a different angle, you see there's one mountain range, and then beyond that is another one, and there's a distance between the two of them. They're not just one. And that sometimes that's what the prophets were doing, even though they may not have known it. They were discussing the two things that God can see and that we can see by looking back, that were going on at the same time.
Okay, and that I've read that explanation too, and that could be. That's one thought. Other comments? Okay, there's another explanation though here, which I wondered about it, and so I did some study on it, and the translation varies here. For the New King James and some others say, I will sow them among the peoples. The English Standard says, though I scattered them, as though it's past tense. And some others say that too. Others leave it undetermined when I scatter them, or although I sow them. And I don't know, honestly, much about the Hebrew language, but what I have heard is that tenses in Hebrew are not as definite as Greek or English. And I wonder if that explains why some translations have it in the past and some in the future or indefinite. If that's the case, this could still be talking about the fact that they went into captivity in Babylon, in Babylonian captivity. And then they remember him and lived together. So it's Terry's explanation that maybe it is a reference to the Messianic kingdom, but another possibility is that it isn't meant to be strictly future, but some translations show it's just when this happened, then here's the effect of it on the people. That's another possibility. Frank?
The tenses of I will sow or I have sown in the study of Isaiah and some of the other prophets, oftentimes when the prophecies are made about what repeating what God has said, he says it, he makes the prophecy about for example, the Assyrians and the Babylonians overcoming, taking the people captive, and then they were being punished for what they had done. Sometimes he speaks as if it's already done, and it hasn't even come about yet historically.
Yes, tenses in the prophecies are not always strictly as what we might expect them to be. So that might be part of it too. Other comments on verse 9? Okay, so in any case, in captivity, they would remember the Lord, live with their children there, and then return, which is continues then into verse 10 as well, as it continues to discuss that he would bring them back. Anything else? Verse 9? Okay, so verse 10 now. Question number 14. They're going to return. Where's they going to come from? And this is, okay, verse 10. Where are they going to come from? Rick?
He's going to bring them back from Egypt and Assyria.
Egypt and Assyria. Well, now, wait a minute. What's the significance of that? Why Egypt and Assyria? I thought they came back from Babylon. What's the significance of Egypt and Assyria then? Well, in their history, what was the historical significance of Egypt, Terry?
Well, their bondage from the time they became slaves in Egypt, and then their captivity when they were in Assyria.
Okay, these are places of captivity, places from which God had brought them back. Originally, it was Egypt, the first time that he brought them out of captivity. They came out of Egypt. Then Israel went into captivity to Assyria. So these are places of captivity in the past. Now, I'm not sure that, but there may have been literally some of those people there, but symbolically, those were places from which God would gather them because that's where they had been in captivity in their past. Where would he bring them? He would bring them from those places to where? The last part of verse 10. Bill.
Gilead and Lebanon.
Gilead and Lebanon. And continue bringing them there until there was no more room to be found for them. So I ask you to check on a map. Where are these places? Where's Lebanon? Compared to got Israel, if you had a map, Israel, what would Lebanon be? Karen?
North.
Both of them. Okay, and by the sea, by the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. How about Gilead? Where would Gilead be? Right.
On the east side of the Jordan River.
Okay, so you've got, when people come back, some of them are going to go north of Israel and some are going to go east across the Jordan River. And even then it's going to be filled. What will be the significance of that? Right.
Back to the land that had been promised to Abraham.
Back to the land promised to Abraham, and so many coming back that the land would be filled. Okay, not just Jerusalem or right around Judah, but the whole area, and even to the north of it and to the east of it. So many come back. So what would be the significance of that then? Again, not necessarily literal in every sense, but what's the significance of it? Terry?
They would overfill the land, like the gospel will spread out from the literal Israel to the whole world.
Okay, so it's a very thorough return, okay? Not just a little bit, a thorough return. And again, if you take it to the physical return from captivity, there would be many would come back and fill the land. If you refer it to the spiritual, then the gospel is going to go beyond the land of Israel itself. Okay? All right. So it's a liberal blessing, not just a little, but a liberal blessing. Many would benefit from it. Other comments on 10? And then verse 11. Verse 11, question number 16 now. What's going to happen in according to verse 11? Bill.
He's going to strike the waves of the sea, and the river will dry out.
All right. He shall pass, it says, through the sea with affliction, strike the waves of the sea, all the depths of the river shall dry up. The pride of Assyria shall be brought down, the scepter of Egypt shall depart. So here we're back to Assyria and Egypt, the symbols of their enemies. Okay? So where the people are going to return, the enemies are going to suffer. Okay? Which is the theme of the book. We've seen repeatedly. Okay, but now he says, he shall pass. Who is the he that passes through with affliction? Right.
Well, I'm not sure whether this is right or not, but they passed through the Red Sea when they left Egypt, and they suffered many afflictions all through their history, wandering in the wilderness and in the captivities of Assyria and Babylon and the other punishments that they received because of their sin.
Okay. And some translations say they shall pass through the sea. So it's a reminder of their past sufferings. That they've been captives in Egypt, captives some in Assyria, and some, of course, now coming back from Babylon, but they've passed through the sea with affliction. That the passage it seemed to me like what Frank is saying, referring back to their coming out of Egypt. They passed through the sea, and that even though they left Egypt, there was still a lot of suffering, a lot of problems as they wandered in the wilderness and so on. God struck the waves of the sea. The depths of the river would dry up. Some think that's the Nile River because of the punishment on Egypt, not literally, but the punishment on Egypt, as the verse continues. Maybe it has another reference. But whereas God's people would return from their suffering, the enemies would be brought down. And the scepter would depart. What does that mean? The scepter of Egypt departs means what? Scepter is what? What's the significance of scepter? Symbol of the king or rulership. So they would cease to rule and be dominant, not only be dominant as they had been in the past. Their authority would be broken. Pride of Assyria brought down, power of Egypt depart. So the enemies suffer, God's people are blessed. And again, a lot of symbolism, and maybe not all clear, but that seems fairly obvious to me that that's where he's going with it. Questions, comments through verse 11? Frank.
That in beginning of verse 11, what it says, he shall pass through the sea, is that referring back to Ephraim? Does Ephraim, is it inclusive of all Israel and Judah?
Well, once again, I think we have to be careful not trying to be too particular with symbolic language. But as I mentioned, some translations say they shall pass through the sea. So I don't think it's meant to be necessarily some specific person or group of people, but just in general God's people. Now that's what I would take it to mean, but maybe maybe I'm missing it, but that's what I took it to mean. Other comments? Anything else to verse 11? Okay, verse 12 then, he closes this section, question number 19. What would God do for them? Verse 12. Strengthened. How?
In the Lord.
Strengthened in the Lord. Not in their own ability, not in their own wisdom or their own power, but in the Lord. The Lord would strengthen them. And what else does it say about him? Bill.
They're going to walk up and down in his name.
Okay, walk up and down in his name, says the Lord. What's the significance of walking up and down in God's name? You walk up and down in God's name, what's that mean? Rick?
You're being active. You're showing that you are God's. You are the Lord's.
Okay, so your conduct is according to God, showing your relationship with God. You're acting by his authority in his name. So that, again, you have a restoration of the people to God's favor, to God's relationship, favor, but the enemies are defeated, which is the theme of the book. We've seen that again and again throughout the book, even starting with Ephesians and all the way through. The people would return from captivity, be returned to God's favor, but the enemies would be punished. Okay? Rick?
I sort of look at that verse there, and I think about all the times that Israel has turned away from God and worshipped other gods and idols, and now he says they're going to walk up and down in his name. They're going to be his children.
In fact, this chapter began, didn't it, in verse 2 with the problem of idolatry, which is why they went into captivity to begin with, because of their idolatry and their following the false teachers who taught them about idols and so on. But now they walk up and down in God's name, yes. Okay? Anything else? Anything else? Okay.
Well, yeah, I had a similar thought as Rick did. I found myself thinking, why is God looking in favor at them at this time? And I thought the same thing as Rick. For one thing, when they come back from Babylon, they seem to pretty much give up idols. It's not that they don't sin anymore, but their long, long, long history of falling into idolatry seems to finally, for the most part, be over. And looking forward from that, that this 400-year time between the close of the Old Testament and the New Testament, God is going to use that time to prepare the way for the Messiah. That things are going to happen during all that time, that it'll be the perfect time for the Messiah to come. So I think that's part of it too.
Okay? Anything else on chapter 10 before we move on? Okay, now we go to chapter 11, and again, if my overview of this is right, I think chapter 11 is going to jump back now and look forward to the future of the nation when the Messiah comes. So, chapter 10, he's receiving them back into his fellowship, restoring his relationship with them. In contrast to the enemies, they're going to be punished. But what's going to happen to this nation now that they come back? What's going to happen to them in the future? And it seems to me like it changes at the beginning of chapter 11. So let's go ahead and read several verses from chapter 11. Won't have time for much. Let's just read the first three verses. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Who'd like to read chapter 11, verses 1 through 3 for us, please? Bill, please.
Open your doors, O Lebanon, that fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O cypress, for the cedars have fallen, because the mighty trees are ruined. Wail, O oaks of Bashan, for the thick forest has come down. There is the sound of wailing shepherds, for their glory is in ruins. There is the sound of roaring lions, for the pride of Jordan is in ruins.
Now, I'm not sure about you, but to me that sounds like a change. Something's different. First of all, in verse 1, he mentions some areas specifically. Two areas. What areas does he mention in verse 1? Actually, it's verse 1 and 3. 1 and 2. He mentions two areas. What areas does he mention in verses 1 and 2? Steve.
Lebanon and Bashan.
Lebanon and Bashan. Does that remind you of anything we talked about already tonight? When those people came back from captivity, where did they go? Back in chapter 10. Lebanon and Gilead. Lebanon's mentioned again. Where is Bashan? Right?
I'm not sure, but I think it's the same area as Gilead.
But a little bit north of it.
Pardon me?
A little bit north of it.
North of Gilead.
Of Gilead, yes.
Okay. I thought it was just different names.
No, I think they're different places, but they're right next to one another.
Oh,
Okay? So, that struck me when I said, okay, they come back from captivity, they go to Lebanon and Gilead, but now, what happens to Lebanon and Bashan? What happens to them now?
They will not be saved.
Well, they're not going to be saved, but instead, that's what's going to happen to them. Terry.
They're open to destruction.
Open to destruction. Fire devouring their cedars. Cypress, the cedar has fallen, the mighty trees are ruined. Bashan was also known for their trees. And so you've got the trees, Lebanon's known for their trees, and Bashan known for their trees. Both of them, the thick forest will come down, fire will devour them. The cedar has fallen. So where these areas were blessed in chapter 10, now there's destruction. in chapter 11. Something's changed. Okay? And verse 13. What do we hear? What sounds are heard in verse 3? With this destruction of the trees and so on, what sounds are heard? Right.
The sounds of the wailing shepherds and the wailing of their leaders.
Okay, the leaders are wailing. The glory is in ruins. The sound of roaring lions, the pride of the Jordan is in ruins. What I have read that along the Jordan River was thick woods and so on, where lots of lions typically live, but that area is going to fall and be destroyed too. So now you get on the Jordan is suffering ruins, and their pride is destroyed. So rather than the blessings on this very area that chapter 10 was talking about blessings, it's going to be destruction and fire. Well, why? We'll leave that for next week, starting in verse 4. But as you read the rest of chapter 11, what's he talking about? It seems to me things have changed. It's in the future now from after chapter 10. Different circumstances, and we'll see why as we get into chapter 11 further next time then. Okay, thank you.